right, we're back. All right, good evening, everybody, and thank you for sticking around for the presentation. Tonight we have the kid from Freeville growing up on the railroad, and we have the kid from Freeville himself, Danny Armitage, who came all the way down here from Ithaca, New York today to be with us. So we're really pleased to have him with us. Danny grew up in Freeville alongside the Lehigh Valley Railroad as a young rail buff, and is here to share some stories about what that experience was like with us. So without further ado, Danny, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to explain how this began. I was up at Steamtown. I have my friend Pete Belisario over here. He's a pretty noted rail photographer. We went up to Steamtown and I met a fellow named Mike Delvecchio, and he immediately recognized my name and said, "Yeah, you've got to come down and do your program at Tri-State." And that got the ball started. And then unfortunately, before he passed away, he got me hooked up with Richard King, and we were able to finalize this and get this all put together. So I thank them and all of you for the invitation. I grew up in Freeville, New York, and it was a place where two lines of the Lehigh Valley crossed. They were the original Elmira, Cortland, and Northern line, which ran from Elmira all the way to Canastota and up to Oneida Lake. And then the other line was the Southern Central Railroad, which ran from Sayre, Pennsylvania, all the way up through Freeville and continued north and went to Lake Ontario. Those lines were both later absorbed by the Lehigh Valley, and the Lehigh continued to operate most of the trackage for the rest of the time. I consider myself a rail fan and a railroader, and as my talk goes on, I think you'll understand why. I rode the Lehigh Valley over 400 times. This was not during the passenger era. This was riding freight locomotives and cabooses and hanging out at stations. In 1960, I started hanging out with a fellow named Ken Rice. Now, where I lived in Freeville, I'll put up the next one. First of all, there's the map. You can see Freeville is there at the crossroads of the two branch lines. At one time, Freeville had 24 passenger trains a day that passed through there, and that didn't count the freights. So you were upwards of 35 to 40 trains a day that went through this little town called Freeville. So it was a busy major rail hub at one time. In 1960, I started hanging out with a fellow named Ken Rice. The freight station was right in my backyard almost. Our property bordered the Lehigh, and the station was right behind me. This is a quick picture of the Freeville freight station. I'm looking south towards Sayre, Pennsylvania. The big white house just off center to the left is where I lived. So you can see the proximity between me and the station. The two lines cross just the other side of that where that boxcar is sitting. Freeville was unique in the system of Ys that they had, where a train could come in from any direction and then go to any other direction or turn completely around to go back where they came from. And they did that through a system of Ys. I started hanging out with Ken Rice. He became like a favorite uncle to me. He was nice, and he allowed kids to hang out and to ask questions and what have you, and he and I became very close friends. In 1963, well, I should back up. The crews would come into the station a lot, and I would be there. So I'd get to know them. I'd hear, learn what their names were and what have you. And they were nice to me. But in 1963, the train came into town one day, and I was out in my backyard where I usually was. And the locomotive pulled up and stopped right next to me. And the fella running it was, his name was Nick Fisk. Nick Fisk literally, from that time forward, became like a second father to me, literally. He stopped the engine and he looked down at me and he goes, "You like trains, don't you?" And I said, "Yeah." And he says, you're out here every day when we come through. I said, yeah. He said, do you ever want to go for a ride? And I said, sure. Well, when do you want to do that? Well, even then I knew not to push anything, don't get too pushy. And I just said, oh, well, sometime when you come in, you're, switching around the yard here. He goes, is your father home? I said, yes, sir. He said, you go home and get your dad. He says, we're going to pull up and back down by the other side of the lumber company. He says, to that crossing. He says, you bring your father down to the crossing. He says, I want to talk to him. I said, okay. So I ran home at the speed of sound, roared into the house, screaming for my father and telling him and saying, you got to come with me. You got to come with me. I think I'm going to get a ride on the train. So he went down. The engine came down by. Nick swung off the engine, came over, met my father, said, look, if you don't mind, he says, well, your son likes the trains. He says, I'll take him down to East Ithaca. We'll be gone an hour and a half. And he says, and I'll keep him right with me, no problem. My father said, fine. So up on the engine I went, and down towards Ithaca we went. Well, now I'm in seventh heaven. I'm trying to suck in all of what was happening. We got down to East Ithaca, got done switching around the yard there, putting the coal over to Cornell University's heating plant, got ready to pull out and leave. And by this time, Nick had been on the fireman's side talking with me on the way down. Now he switched places with the fireman, and now he was at the engineer's seat. And he motioned me to come over. So I went over, he had me sit in front of him, and he said, you know what the whistle signal is for a crossing? And I said, yes, I do. He goes, what is it? I said, 2 longs, a short, and a long. He says, that's right. He said, see that valve right there? He says, every time you see one of those white W signs, he says, you start blowing 2 longs, a short, and a long for the next crossing. Okay, so all the way home, I got to blow the whistle at all the crossings between Ithaca and Freeville. So now I was hooked. Now I was 8 years old at the time. So, this was pretty exciting for me. So I continued to hang around the railroad, and I continued to hang around with Ken Rice there at the station. And after a while, once in a while now, as I got a little older, I'd get another ride. Usually not very far. It's usually just around Freeville while they were switching cars around. But you had to understand there were 2 trains running on this branch. One was the Auburn train, the other was the Cortland train. So the trains would be in town oftentimes at the same time. Well, other crews started seeing me up in the locomotive. So one day, a different engineer came into town. He told me to get up on the engine. I got up there. His name was Donnie Hoy. He said, you don't have to just ride with Nick Fisk on this railroad. He says, you can ride with other people too. Well, that began my second ride. As the years went by and as I got older, obviously the invitations became more often. And of course, when I got into my early teens to where I could be passed off to maybe be a crew member, then it got to the point where I didn't even have to wait for an invitation. When they'd come into town, I'd just swing on the engine or swing on the caboose and go for a ride wherever. I had parents that were, loving enough to trust those guys, because in this day and age, I wouldn't let my own kid do this the way the world is today. But back then, my parents, they were in favor of it. And the crews became friends with my family also, with my mother and father. Now I was an only child, but they became friends with them. And what would happen was the Lehigh downgraded the lines to a secondary status. And under federal law at that time, you were not allowed to run 2 trains at a time on a secondary line. Well, the Lehigh got around by just running 2 trains on the line with no train orders. So the crews would, when they'd go to leave Sayre or whatever, they'd call the Buffalo dispatcher by phone. He'd say, well, the Moravian man left an hour ahead of you going westbound. That's all they knew. It was up ahead of them, someplace an hour ahead was another train. And of course, being that they were on one line, but then splitting off separately, And then later coming back to that one line, it became interesting because they'd come over or call my house and call me, my father, my mother. Hey, have you seen the other guy? And which way was he going? So now my home is a partial dispatch center. So then of course these guys would get hungry, and you know, the train would pull into town. I'd swing up on the engine. I'd be talking with the guys. Hey, is your mother home? Yeah. She got any coffee over there? Probably. Well, tell her we'll be over in about 10 minutes. Okay. Well, that began an almost regular routine of these crews coming to my house. So much so that my grandmother bought my mother a 30-cup coffee dispenser for Christmas one year. And, you know, oftentimes they were hungry. Mom would make them a sandwich or whatever. And, you know, and the nice thing was they got taken care of and I got to ride. They literally took me under their wing and taught me how to be safe on the railroad, how to work on the railroad. And as I got older, you know, they would entrust more and more stuff to me. Now, railroaders, I know there's some in this room, you'll probably disagree with me, but the truth is railroaders are a lazy bunch. If they can get around something, they will. So I started getting issued cases of flares, switch keys, lanterns for nighttime, and what have you, because at one point the Cortland train was coming out of Sayre, going up to Cortland, and a lot of times they'd come back through. Well, there was 2 switches on one of those Ys that had to be hand thrown, and Route 38 crossing had to be flagged. So how do you get around that problem? Give all this stuff to the kid, lay on the whistle out of coming into town, and I'd run down and throw the 2 switches and pop the flare and stop the traffic, and the way they'd come through. They didn't have to stop. So that took some of their work off of them. As I said before, as the rides became more and more frequent as you know, as I increased with age. So much so that in 1969, my parents were involved in a serious motor vehicle accident. They both ended up at Robert Packer Hospital in Sayre. Well, I had an uncle that I lived with, but you know, I'm kind of on my own. So how do I get down to see them? Well, I'd get out of school, hop on the train in the afternoon, go into Sayre. I'd ride down there, either stay in their room, a couple times stayed in a motel. Next morning, get on the train coming back westbound and ride it back home and get to school. Sometimes a little late, but that was all right. And that was how I went and saw them. And of course, the crews all knew about my parents, and you know, they really were looking out for me. After I got old enough to where I was in my teens, to where I really understood the workings of the railroad, they started depending on my family and me even more, because the railroad was slowly dying and a lot of things were happening that weren't quite kosher. For example, running 2 trains with no train orders. So what would happen then is somebody on the crew would get sick, drunk, or whatever, to where they couldn't perform their duties. And if it was during the daytime, my mother would get a phone call, and it would be one of my friends, you know, Nick Fisk or whoever, saying, hey, we know Danny's in school, but you know, the brakeman's in the caboose and he can't work today. But we need an extra hand. Do you think you could go get him out of school and meet us in Owego, New York, or North Valley, New York, or wherever? So my mother would shuttle me down there, and for the rest of the day, I'd be a brakeman or whatever. This even went to where when I was in the 11th grade in high school, I took the ride up to Moravia back, like I'd done dozens of times. And when we got done up in Moravia, which was the end of the line at that time, you know, the crew was hungry and what have you. So over to the local little gin mill, I guess is what you call it, but it was a restaurant too. We went over there to have dinner. Well, the engineer's name was Bill, And the conductor's name was Bart, and Bart was actually the brother of this Nick Fisk you've heard me talk about. So we went over, had a meal, got done, and I noticed that the engineer had a couple of martinis while we were there. So I didn't think much about it. So we came walking back out to the locomotive. Should have clicked in when I noticed that the head brakeman was dropping back to ride the caboose. And I said to the conductor, I says, "Hey, Bart," I says, "Where's Bill?" "He was on the engine, I guess." I says, No. He said, "He was still in there when you and I walked out." I said, "He's not on the engine." He turned around, I hear him say, "Oh my God." I said, "What's the matter?" He says, "He got a 6-pack in a bag under his arm." Okay, so up on the engine we went and headed down westbound or eastbound to start heading towards Sayre, Pennsylvania. So we get to Groton, New York, and without warning, engineer reaches over and dumps the air. We slide to a halt, and he bails off the side of the locomotive. And now remember, in the cab now is the engineer, the conductor, and myself. And I said, "What the hell is he doing?" And he goes, "Oh my God, he's walking over into town. He's going to go get another 6-pack," because he'd already finished the first one. So pretty soon, a little bit, here he comes, gets back over, gets up on the train, whistles a highball, and away we go. So now we're about a mile out of Freeville, where I lived. And of course, it was a school night. And Bart whispers in my ear, he says, "You're going to Sayre tonight." I said, "I am?" He said, "Yeah." He says, "I'll bring you home." He says, because Bart lived in Cortland, New York, which is near where I lived, near Freeville. He says, "I'll drive you back home tonight." He says, I says, "Well, okay." He says, "Look," he says, "he's in another 5 to 10 miles. He's not going to be in any shape to keep running this train." He says, "I don't know how to run this locomotive," but he says, "I know you do." And he says, "I want to get home tonight." So he said, "That's the plan." Okay. So before we got to Dryden, New York, which is the next town below Freeville, we take old Bill, put him over on the fireman side of the cab. I get on the engineer's side, and I take the train 68 miles to Sayre, Pennsylvania, so the crew could get home. In later years, I had many of the guys on the railroad thank me for that, because again, they said, "What would have happened if you hadn't have been there?" And of course, a lot of things went on with the railroad that were, especially on the Lehigh, where everybody took care of each other. And if somebody screwed up, made a mistake, whatever, you covered it over and you got through it. The only time that my friend Nick Fisk allowed me to run the engine was in 1973. Other engineers had let me run engines and what have you, but Nick he had never offered it, and I didn't ask. And even though we had become very close, and finally in 1973, I was getting ready to graduate from high school, and I said to Nick, I said, "Hey," I said, "what are you getting me for graduation?" He said, "I ain't getting you a damn thing." And I said, "Well," he says, "what do you want?" I said, "I want to run the locomotive." He says, "You couldn't run a wheelbarrow." I said, "Well, maybe not a wheelbarrow, but I said, but I can run one of these engines." I says, he says, "Huh." He says, "Meet me in Owego tomorrow, 8 o'clock in the morning." He said, "When we come up through," he says, "we'll probably have a whole bunch of gas cars going to the LP facility up in Hartford." He said, "Then if you can pull that train up Flemingville Hill without doubling the hill," he says, "I'll call you an engineer." Okay. So I got my mother drive me to Owego, New York, get down there by 8 o'clock. Sure enough, they come pulling in. Got on the engine. Nick never said anything. I didn't say anything. I'm sitting on the other side of the cab, got the train put together. He just starts to open the throttle to pull out of town. And he gets up and he goes, "There you are." And he walks over to the fireman's side. I walked over, sat in the engineer's seat, took the train to Freeville. And we only had 4 gas cars that day in the consist. So I didn't have any problem pulling up Flemingville Hill. And of course, on the way, the word had spread thanks to my mother and what have you. So some of my relatives, so many of my friends, whatever, were all out on the line waiting for the end to bring the train by. So that was one of my exciting times. Nick Fisk was was interesting, and I'll tell you a little of his history. Now, he was a Italian, very Italian. His original name was Fusco, but his grandfather had changed it when he came into the country because he didn't think it sounded American enough. So Nick was, he was a very well-respected engineer on the railroad. You could just tell by the way the crews operated around him and with him and what have you. And so one day I got asking him after he retired, we were at a luncheon together, and I asked him, I said, hey, how'd you get, or when did you get on the railroad? He goes, didn't I ever tell you that story? And I said, no. He said, well, he says, I got on the railroad, he says, and they handed me this application. So I wrote on it, and it asked, on the application, it asked for nationality. So I put Dutch. He said, I submitted it. He said, next thing I knew, he said, I got hired and told to report to Buffalo, and I was going to be in engine service. And so he, said, well, he said, I wanted to get back to Cortland, which eventually he did through the nicety of a superintendent who helped him out. And he finally got back to Cortland, where he was from and where his family was. And of course, stupid me, I have to ask the question, well, why'd you write down Dutch? He said, how many Dago engineers you seen on this railroad? And I said, come to think of it, you're the only one. He says, because I'm Dutch. I said, okay. So that just kind of shows you how things were back in those days. Bart Fisk was his brother. He was crazy. He literally was. He was a food thief. He got caught by a rear flagman stealing a sandwich out of his grip every day. So he made a sandwich up with Alpo dog food and put that on top the following day. And Bart took it and ate it. And then, of course, Ronnie told him what it was really made of. But Bart was a character, but he was very good to me. Some other names, some of you may recognize Jim Lathrop. He was very well known in the railroad world. He lived to be 100. He had a phenomenal memory, and he could tell you anything about the operations of a steam locomotive or the operations of the railroad or what have you. Leo Gorman was an engineer out of Sayre who loved his job. And anytime you got on a locomotive with Leo, he was going to teach you something. He was going to have you out on the gangway with the doors open, showing you this and that and how this worked and what have you. Great guy. Dave Whipple was an older fella who was on the extra board. He usually covered the vacations. Probably the worst train handler in existence. He was awful. Great guy. He'd bring a grip to work. And Nick used to tell me, hey, if he ever offers you an apple or a piece of pie, he says, take it because he's got 6 more in that thing. And because his wife would make him these huge lunches or whatever. And sometimes they'd get stuck someplace. And that's where the crew would eat. They'd eat out of his duffel bag. Anyway, Whip was had a habit of coming to a stop where anybody that knows train operations, he's got the train brake he's working, he's bailing off the engine brake so that he's not bunching the train up. He'd get down to about 3 miles per hour, and then he'd release the engine or the train brake, and he'd throw the independent brake on or the engine brake on. And of course, what that did was that just pounded that train forward. And of course, what caught it the worst was usually the caboose. So one day, this guy named Bobby Morris, who was a wonderful human being, never cussed or swore. He's just the nicest guy in the world, but he was the rear brakeman. They pulled into town one day, so I'm down to the crossing waiting for him. Of course, Whip's doing his normal stop, crash. And Bobby comes running up alongside the train. And he's screaming. And he gets up by the window in the locomotive, and he's pointing his finger at Whip, and he's going, when the hell are you going to learn how to operate a train? He says, you're the worst locomotive engineer on this railroad. He goes, yesterday, he says, you knocked the coffee pot off the stove. He says, today, he says, you knocked the whole stove over. He says, he said, and of course, they got into a verbal battle, but that was the end. But that showed you how he was. One day, the train came into town. It was Nick's train. He came in from Portland. And he had a problem. He had an RS3 that was leaking water severely. So he looks at me and he goes, well, he says, I don't suppose you got a garden hose that can reach down here. And I says, no, not that far. My backyard was pretty big. So, but I had just joined the local volunteer fire department. And the chief was my neighbor across the street. And he also knew Nick. So I ran over, got him. The chief and I went down, got the tanker out, brought it up. And on board, the second train that came into town was a guy named Dick Redmond, and he was a worker out of the shops. He was riding a Baldwin switcher that was having some issues, so he came over to try to help. When I came back with the fire truck, crew was all sitting on my backyard in the grass. And I came in and we pulled the fire truck up. I grabbed the hose, whatever. This Dick Redmond started to get up, and Nick says, sit down. He says, the kid knows what to do. He says, just leave him alone. So he sat back down. I got up on the engine, put the hose into the top of it, filled it up with water, whatever, got all done. He came over and introduced himself, and he goes, wow, he says, thanks a lot for helping out today. He says, you ever get down to Sayre much? And I said, yeah, once in a while. He said, you ever been in the shops? And I said, yeah, I have briefly. And he said, well, he says, I work down there. He says, I'm in the electrical department. And he said, next time you come to Sayre, he says, you will come in the office and ask for me. And he says, and I'll get you a tour of the shops. I says, well, that's all right. So 1 week later, because I wasn't going to let this guy forget who I was, I drive to Sayre, Pennsylvania, because I had my license by then. And I go into the shops and I asked for him. And pretty soon somebody found him, and he came to the office. And he goes, oh God, he said, I wish you'd have come yesterday. He says, yesterday, he said, we sat around here twiddling our thumbs. He says, we didn't have much to do. He says, but today, he says, we got quite a project going with these snowbirds. And he said, there's a lot of rewiring we got to do. He says, but hang on. He says, I'll take care of you. So he went over and got some jamoke that was sitting in doing nothing. Come back out, had a white helmet, put the white helmet on me. He told the other guy, he says, you take him anywhere he wants to go in these shops. He says, let him see whatever he wants to see. Okay. So away we go through the shops. For the next 4 hours, I toured the Sayre shops, including the outside, where the car shops were and everything else. Got to get up into the private car of the president of the railroad would use. Then I met back up with Dick. He took me down into the pit underneath one of the big Alco C628s, showing me what the problems were with the trucks, with the wiring, and everything else. Got all done, and he says, well, he says, have you seen those new locomotives? We just got some new GP38-2s. He said, there's some down on the ready track. Did you see them when you came in? And I said, yeah. He said, well, when you leave here, he says, take this road out of the shops. He says, that'll take you right down to the service area. He said, I'll call ahead and tell them you're coming. He says, you take a look at these new engines. We just got them. I said, okay. So I get down there. 2 guys come out of the little shanty they had there. And of course, this great big tall fella, he's wearing a white hat too, like I am. And he walks over and introduces himself. He said, I understand you're a VIP friend of the railroad. And he said, I'm also told that you know a lot about these locomotives. And I said, I've been around a few of them. He told the fellow, one of the hostlers that was there, he says, you take this young man up there. And he says, let him run nose around the yard a little bit. Okay. So I got up there. Of course, the hostler would get off, throw a switch where we needed or whatever, and I got to run him around the yard for a while. So that was fun. Of course, I got to go back home and tell this Nick Fisk, who just worked the branches. I said, hey, you been on any of those new locomotives? And he goes, they only give me goats. He says, I don't get no good engines. I said, well, I got to run okay. I got to give him a little jab. Leo Searfoss was a car knocker. When we'd go up to Cortland, the crew would do their work, and then they'd leave the train and go get something to eat. I'd stay behind, and Leo was the car inspector, and so I'd run the brake tests for him. He'd check out the train, And when the crew would come back from Cortland, walking down the sidewalk, their train was now coming across the crossing and meeting them at the station, because I would bring it down to them. And Billy McLean was another last one I'll tell you about. Wonderful guy. He was an engineer, a lot of experience. He actually started out firing on the Black Diamond in the steam era. But anyway, Billy became a good friend, and there was a portion of time where I didn't see these guys. I mean, I had gotten older. I was in the workforce. I was, getting married and things like that, and starting a family. So there was a number of years where I didn't see these guys much, and of course the railroad was dying and they were getting pulled back and what have you, different lines were coming off. And anyway, I found out one day that they were going to have one of these luncheons. We used to have them all over the place, and now everybody's dead, so we don't have them very often. But we used to have a pretty big one that was up in Cortland. So I happened to be off work that day, so I drove over to Cortland. Well, I walked in and the place went crazy, because these guys hadn't seen me in a long time. I hadn't seen them, and all of a sudden these guys were like, "Oh my God!" And the kid from Freeville comes from, if a guy knew who I was, or if they were talking about me and they couldn't remember my name, they'd say, the kid from Freeville. And so these guys were all going crazy. This Billy McLean, he jumps up, takes $10 out of his wallet and gives it to the treasurer, and he says, "This guy is now going to be a member of the Lehigh Valley Veterans Association." He says he rode the railroad as much as we did, and so he paid for my first year. I was on the train in 1972 when we were going up to Moravia, and we got north of Freeville, out in kind of the middle of nowhere. And I was on the engine. Well, the crew, of course, had come over to my house for lunch. So naturally, when they got done with lunch, I'm going for a ride. And the air went on, and I looked out the fireman's side back towards the train, and something wasn't right, but I didn't know what. So ran over to the other side of the engine, threw the door open, grabbed the handrail, and I'm looking down the side, and the fireman was running. We're still sliding to a halt. And he says, "Are we on the ground?" And I'm watching the cars roll down the embankment. And I said, "I guess we are." And then he says, "What about the caboose?" And I said, "I don't see it." And so I bailed off the engine. We were about to a halt by that time. I ran back, and of course I'm a high schooler. I'm in good shape. Those guys are, they're a lot older and not in good shape. So I got back there way before they did, and the caboose laid on, it's almost on its top with the smoke from the coal stove coming out the windows. And I hollered, no response. And I hollered again, no response. And then the guys from the head end, they caught up with me. And I heard the one guy looked, and he goes, "Oh, Jesus." He says, "Are they talking?" And I hollered again. And now this Bobby Morris, the same guy I said earlier, was such a nice guy, no profanity. Well, he let loose with profanity. And let me tell you, now we knew they were alive and not dead. And they got out of the caboose finally. One guy got little burns on his arm from the coal stove. But anyway, now my job was to walk back to Freeville, get a hold of Kenny Rice, the agent, and report the wreck to the railroad. Okay, because now the engine was on the wrong side of the wreck. They couldn't get back to Freeville. So I did, and a little while later, a few days later, on a Sunday morning, a section crew came into town, the track crew. And the guy who I knew named Ray Bennett was the section foreman. Well, they're hungry, needed coffee, whatever. So over to my house they come. And they're sitting there and eating, and all of a sudden I got thinking, and I said, "Hey, Ray," I says, "why are you guys here on a Sunday?" And he goes, "Well," he says, "there's a little funny story about that." I said, "Yeah." I said, "You guys work Monday through Friday." And he goes, "Yeah, I know." He says, "Well, there was a wreck up here," he says, "north of Freeville." And I said, "Oh yeah, I know." He goes, "Were you on it?" I says, "Yeah." He says, "Were you on the caboose?" And I said, "No," because they'd already knew that the caboose had tipped over. I said, "Oh, I was on the engine." And he says, "Well," says, "the railroad, because we carry these LP gas cars, is worried about the ICC, Interstate Commerce Commission, coming in to investigate the accident. And the railroad does not want it to be their fault. So he said, we are going up there today to install a broken rail at the scene. I says, you gotta be kidding me. He goes, nope. He says, that's our job today, to go up and put a broken rail into the scene. So one of the very few times I ever had a camera with me, I grabbed the camera that day and I said, I gotta get a picture of this. I said, just for me. So I went up with them, and while they did that, and it was just one of the many things, you know. They closed the Freeville station, and they moved the agent, this Kenny Rice, they moved him to Dryden, the next town 5 miles away. And so a couple of things happened. One was the railroad put a phone box on the telephone pole next to the station with a telephone in it so the crews could call. So my job now was to get a hold of my friend who worked for the phone company and get 100-foot cable put on that telephone, so that if they got caught there and had to sit there for hours, and if it was wintertime or something, they could bring the phone out of the phone box and bring it up into the engine or the caboose, where they could leave it there and not have to stand out in the weather trying to wait for a call. So I did that. And then the day that they closed the Freeville freight station, I got a hold of, my dad was home, I got a hold of him, and I said, come on, I said, we got a little job to do. He goes, what's that? I said, just come on. So I said, grab the extension ladder. I said, I'll meet you down. We got to go down to the station. So we went down, and with a crowbar and a ladder, and I pulled the 2 signs off the station. It said Freeville. And that was it. We came home. Well, the following Monday, I was at school, but I had my dad's car. And I drove over to the Dryden station to say hi to my buddy, Kenny Rice. And he saw me coming, and he came running out of the station. And he goes, oh my God, he says, somebody's already stole the signs off the station. And I said, really? And he goes, I don't even know how anybody knew it was closed. He says, I just locked the door Friday. He says, I came by there this morning, the signs are gone. I said, no kidding, Kenny. And we were standing next to my dad's station wagon. I opened the door up and I go, Kenny, I said, this one's yours. I said, I get the other one. I says, you get one, I get one. Nobody else spent more time in that station than you and I. And he goes, oh my God, you're an angel from heaven. So I gave him a sign. I kept one. 40 years later, which brings us to this time period, Freeville they created what's called Station Park. It's a little bit of a park that's all got a railroad theme. It's got pictures and stuff. It's also a bus stop for the local bus transportation in the county. And they did a very nice job. They even put in a small section of rail and ties and what have you. And they had the Freeville State come over and measured up my sign one day so that their sign would be the right dimensions and stuff. And so they had invited me to come over and be a part of this celebration because the Freeville had just gotten one of those historical markers given to them, okay, which celebrated the rail hub of Freeville. So they wanted me to come over and they said, we'd like you to speak at this little ceremony we're going to have and what have you. And I said, well, so as long as we're going to do that, and I says, I've got something for the village too. So we had the little celebration, quite well attended. A couple weeks before, we got interviewed by the local news station. They did a little segment about us. And anyway, so when they got done with their hoopla over the new sign, then I brought out the Freeville sign. And I said, I'm donating this to the village under 2 conditions. I said it can be kept indoors. And I says, and I want my name on a plaque or something on the back of it that just said that I'm the one that gave it to you. And you know, everybody went crazy and what have you. And so now that sign resides over the historian's office in their village hall. And it all went off pretty well. But I kept the sign for like 40 years. I know I'm talking a lot, but again, I'll show a few slides in a minute. One more thing with another fellow I got to know, his name was Vic Cole, and he was the road foreman of engines for the entire Lehigh Valley Railroad system. And he was on a plow train one night when they came into town. And of course, I saw him coming with the plow, and as I approached, I saw, you know, if somebody was around, I'd get the wave off, an arm would come out the door or the window or something, and it'd be like, not now. Well, later, I'm out there watching them switch around, and my friend Nick Visk was the engineer, and he comes up, gets off the engine, and he goes, "Your mother got anything over there to eat and drink?" And I says, "Yeah, she always does." Well, he says, "I got the road foreman with me." He says, "Vic Cole," and he says, "You can't take the ride tonight." He says, I said, "That's fine, I know." And he said, "We'll be over for coffee." So he brought this Mr. Cole over to my house, and they had coffee and what have you. And many years later, when at one of our luncheons, Mr. Cole was there, and he was, I think, in his 90s by that time. So we went and had our luncheons and had our talks and what have you. And when we got all done, I met up with him out in the foyer of this hotel we were at. And I said, "Well, Mr. Cole," and I shook his hand. I said, "I'm Danny Armitage." And I said, I'm from Freeville. And he goes, "Oh, yeah, Freeville." He says, "You're the kid from Freeville." And I says, "Yeah." He says, "I came to your house one time. Your mother gave us," he said, "I was on a plow train with Nick Fisk." He says, "And your mother fed us and gave us coffee and stuff." I said, "Yeah, that's right." Now, this was many years before. And he says, "Yeah." And I said, he said, "I always knew about you." And I said, "You did?" And he goes, "Yeah." I said, "It sounds like I had the blessing of management." I said, "When I was writing your engines and stuff," because I said, "I don't think you realize how many times I rode your railroad." And he goes, "Oh, no." He says, "I knew all about you." He said, "No," he said, "you didn't have the blessing." He said, "If the wrong guy had seen you, there'd have been hell to pay." But he said, "I knew who you were with. You were with guys like Jimmy Lathrop and Nick Fisk and Dave Whipple." He says, "I knew that they'd take care of you and that you'd be all right." And he said, "So I didn't worry about it. I looked the other way." I said, "Wow." I said, "I can't believe that this high up administrator knew about me the whole time." The last guy I'm going to tell you about is a guy named Yano. Yano was a brakeman who worked out of the Sayre yard, and he worked on the main line. I didn't know him, but the story was related to me through Chief Bednar, brother to Mike Bednar, if any of you know him. And Keith was saying that Yano was he was of mixed descent, I think Russian or something, and he didn't speak great English. But he was considered by everybody on the railroad to be the dumbest brakeman on the railroad. And his nickname was Doorknob. And he used to come around and ask the other guys, "Why they call me Doorknob?" Well, maybe it's because you're dumb as one. So anyway, he showed his colors quite brilliantly one time when he was on a train coming out of Coxton, coming back towards Sayre. And they were coming up the mountain. And of course, he's the rear brakeman, so he's in the caboose with the conductor whose name was Joe. And as they're coming along, the air goes on, the train grinds to a halt. Well, of course, the conductor, he hops off and starts walking the train. Now, Lehigh never had radios, any kind of luxury like that. So he's walking the train, and of course, it was a long mainline train, 100+ cars. And he got halfway up the train, and then he heard the engine, a whistle, a go ahead. Well, whatever the problem was, apparently was up near the head end. They fixed it. They're ready to go again. So, okay, he turns around, starts heading back towards the caboose. Well, the train is starting to pull, and pretty soon it's going, and pretty soon he starts to realize that, well, here comes the caboose, but getting on it may be a little problematic. They're going a little faster than I had hoped. So he starts hollering for Yano, and he's screaming at him, and he's going, "Yano, Yano, don't leave me, Yano." He says, "Don't leave me." So instead of Yano putting the air on the caboose and stopping the train again so Joe could get on, Yano jumped off the caboose to be with Joe. True story, I'm told. I'm told that it's a very true story. Would you like to see a few slides? Yeah. Okay. Again, there's Freeville. As I said, Freeville had 24 passenger trains a day that went through there. Now, Freeville's a small town, 300 and some people. their families lived there. This was the passenger station that predated me, but that passenger station for a branch line station had men's and women's bathrooms, which was a rarity in those days. It had a restaurant, it had a baggage room, it had a ticket office, and it had everything. And this is in a small little town, but it happened to be serviced by two major lines of the railroad. Another picture of it, and this shows some of the trains in town. Now, twice a day, there 4 trains would come into town from each direction, and they would exchange passengers and freight. So this is what's happening in this photo. Actually, a little girl in the picture there was a local girl who grew up and ended up having a little restaurant right there in Freeville, and she happened to be in that picture when she was a child. This was the freight station. This is where the 2 lines crossed. On the back side, you see some cars parked, and on the other to the right in the back, out of sight, is my yard, and that's where I lived. And it was a 5-sided station, pretty much unique. We've never found another one anywhere else, and it was 5-sided so that it would fit between those cross tracks. Again, that was my second home. This was Ken Rice. He was the one that was like a favorite uncle. This is the guy I hung out with for hours and hours at a time, and he was gracious enough to put up with it. This is Ken hooping up orders to an engineer whose train is coming into town. Also, let me say, I take no credit for any of these pictures except the ones that I tell you about. I acquired a large collection of Lehigh Valley slides, and I can't tell you who took the slides. And I've done this program before and had somebody in the audience say, well, I took that picture, you know. I don't doubt it because I don't know who took these many of these photos. This was at Freeville. This was well, the top of it was cut off, but this was the semaphore that governed the 2 lines. Now the lines didn't cross 90 degrees, they crossed at an angle. So the order boards were, they were also at an angle, but there was one lever that controlled both. When you raised the lever, one would go clear, the other would go stop. And that was built out of wood, and it was built by the Southern Central Railroad that preceded the Lehigh Valley Railroad. And that still exists today down in Newark Valley, New York, at a small museum they have there. This was Nick Fisk. Like I said, he was a second father to me, and I mean that sincerely. I spent a lot of time with that man, and he helped grow me up. And he was a guy that I never wanted to let down. And he was just a great guy. But another thing about Nick, he called me up to his house one night, because again, I lived about 10 miles away. And he told me, I was just out of high school by that time. And he wanted me to come to his house. He needed to talk to me. It had to be that night. I don't know, okay. Because he'd never done that before. So I go up there, and he said, I want to talk to you. He says, are you going to go to college this fall? And I said, no, I am not planning on it at this point. Well, I need to know. He says, because they're going to hire 5 brakemen down in Sayre. And he said, I've got the application here. He says, you fill it out. He said, I know you like the railroad. He said, I'll put it in for you. But he says, if you think you're going to college, I don't want you to take this job. He says, because you'll make too much money and you'll never go to college. And I said, well, college isn't in my bailiwick at this moment. So anyway, I filled it out. He took it to Sayre. He put it in. One day I get a phone call, a report to Sayre, such and such a morning, 9 o'clock, for an interview. So I said, okay. So I actually took a buddy of mine. I'd gotten another form, and I had a buddy of mine fill it out. So the 2 of us went down to Sayre. I said, well, let's go to work for the railroad. So I get down there, and the room is full of, there's probably 25, 30 guys in there. Now they were hiring 5 positions at once. So there was a lot of people there vying for those jobs. So Larry Cardone was the train master, who I did not know at the time, and he walked in the room. And he said, "Who's the guy from Freeville?" "Well, that would be me, sir, in my office." Okay, so I left the room with the other guys, went into his office. He said, "Shut the door." Okay. He said, "You know people on this railroad?" I said, "Yeah, I know a few." He said, I said, "Why do you ask?" And he goes, "Well, how many do you know?" And I said, "Well, I know about everybody that works on the Buffalo division and the Auburn and Cortland branches." I said, "I don't know too many down on the east side." "Well," he said, "the three highest seniority engineers on this railroad, on this division," he said, "they were in my office this morning and they told me if I didn't hire you, I was an asshole. Because you know more about this railroad than I do." So, okay. And I'm thinking, where is this interview going now? He said, "When do you want to go to work?" I said, "Sir," I said, "I'll go to work whenever you tell me to." He said, you want to go to work today?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Okay." He said, "I'm putting you on at 2 o'clock." He says, "That gives you seniority over the other four that I hire." I said, "Oh, I understand that part of this deal." He said, "Here's a medical form." He says, "Go over to Packer Hospital, go see that doctor." He says, "Get a physical." And he says, "Then come back." He says, "I'll have all your stuff done, your paperwork done." He says, "You'll be ready to go to work at 2 o'clock. Okay, so I go over to Packer, I go to the doctor, and I failed the physical. I was nearsighted in one eye. In my pocket, I had a New York State driver's license, and I had an FAA pilot's license. And I was allowed to fly an airplane and drive a car without glasses, but I couldn't get work on the railroad with one eye. It was nearsighted. If I'd have gotten hired, I could have lost sight in one eye completely and lost half vision in the other, and they couldn't have gotten rid of me. But that's the way the rules were back then. And I tried to bribe the doctor. He was a crotchety old guy. I offered him $1,000 cash, you know, if he'd have just marked down that I was okay and I'd passed the eye test. Nah, he wouldn't do it. So I go over to back to the shop or to the station, see the train master. Said, "Mr. Carter." He says, "Oh, I got everything for you." He had the stuff on his desk. He had keys and he had a lantern and he had this and that. I said, "Well, we got a problem." I said, "I just went over there and failed the medical exam." He goes, "You what?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "I just failed the exam." I said, he said, "My eyesight isn't good enough." And he goes, "Jesus." He says, I just put the paperwork through on you." He said, now I got to unhire you." I said, "Okay." I said, "That's the way it is." I said, "I'm not happy about this either." So I go over to the engine service tracks and all these guys are waiting for me. They knew I was coming into town. They knew I was going to be interviewed. They knew I was going for this job. They knew I'd be working on the railroad with them. I go over there and they all come out and they go, "Oh, when do you start? When do you start?" I said, "Well," I said, "I was supposed to start at 2 o'clock." I said, "It's not happening now." I explained to them what happened. Well, they were just, you know, of course, these guys were all hired back in the steam days. They didn't have such rules back then. You know, if you could breathe and handle a shovel, you were hired. Well, they saw, they said, "Well, geez, we can't believe it. You know a lot more about this railroad, blah, blah, blah." So I'm just sitting there dejected, and this Billy McLean, this nice engineer that was my friend, he comes over and he goes, puts his arm on me and he goes, "Did he tell you were hired?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "My start time was 2 o'clock today." "Well, then you can tell your grandchildren you were a brakeman on the Lehigh Valley Railroad." Because he said, "They told you were hired." I said, "Yeah, I guess so." Nick's brother, Bart, he'd go into restaurants. We'd have to watch him. He'd steal the donuts off the counters and stuff. Nice guy, but food thief. Okay. This is a train that's coming into Freeville at the station. Kenny Rice is here on the ground. They've only got a caboose hop for now, but they're going to break off and pick up some cars that the Cortland job had left for them. So next photo. Here they are. This little, it's hard to make out, but there's like a little tower there that my dad had put out in the backyard for me and the neighborhood kids. It was a plaything. But it had a big sign on it that said Lehigh Valley that I had painted and put on the thing. So if anybody said, "Did Freeville have a tower?" I'd say, "Yep, they did. Freeville did have a tower." So anyway, the train's pulling down. I'm gonna hook on. This is the Lehigh Valley's one and only Baldwin road switcher. This was picture was taken back in the 50s. It was an engine that it started off good, but rapidly it became problematic, and eventually it stayed in this area yards for the rest of its life. But this was a picture of it coming into town. And go ahead, Pete. This is the Diamond. You know, the station is just off to the right side of the picture. They're facing, looking towards Auburn. Behind me would be Sayre, to the left would be Ithaca, and to the right would be Cortland. Another train coming into town with a load of pipe when they were putting a underground gas service in through the area. This was and I just distinctly remember this. I was a young kid, but the train came into town one day, and of course they had these passenger cars on it. So I'm up in the third floor attic of my house, which I could look down and see everything from. And it was an office car special with the president of the railroad going on a tour of the lines. So, and this is of course the car number 353, which resides at Steamtown today. This was the last plow train to come out of Auburn. This was before they cut the line back from Auburn to Moravia, New York. And my friend Billy McLean was the engineer. And they, go ahead, Pete. They were pulling into town, clearing the line, and a couple of crew, section crew guys getting on to help clean switches and what have you. This was the station after they had closed it. As you can see, the sign is missing off the station. And again, it was a unique station, 5-sided. The only thing that exists in this photograph today is that pole, the telegraph pole. That's the only thing that's left there, because they knocked everything down and they put an old folks home there. So, but now this was a wreck that happened south of Dryden. As you're going railroad east towards Sayre, Pennsylvania. My friend Nick Fisk was the engineer. He felt the rail break under the engine as he passed over it. And the engine stayed on, but the rest of the cars didn't. Go ahead. And of course, the wreck train came up to pick up the pieces. And actually, my friend Kenny Rice took me over to see the wreck. I was a young kid at the time, and Kenny took these pictures. And this one I love. They're sitting there with a big hook, trying to get make a lift on that car. But if you look at the picture carefully, look at that guy over there on the trestle. He's down there on his knees watching the trestle to see if that thing's going to hold that big 250-ton hook. And I keep thinking to myself, what's he going to do if that trestle did start to collapse? I mean, but he's there watching and making sure that if something starts to go wrong, he can maybe stave it off. One of the section crew guys with their speeder came into town. That speeder was like a Cadillac compared to what most of the speeders were that the Lehigh had, because this was all enclosed. John F. Nash, the last president of the railroad, with his first high rail car, came into Freeville one day, and was making an inspection of the line. This was engine 167, a boxcar, and a caboose that were all jazzed up, painted up, whatever, that were towed up to Groton, New York for the centennial of that village's party. And the railroad brought it up, put it on display there, and let people walk through it and whatever. And these were the guys, I knew all of them very well. And they were the guys that were on the return trip, actually taking this train back down to Sayre. But it was interesting. Even with the railroad falling apart, they still tried to be part of the community. This was the wreck north of Freeville that I mentioned earlier. This is me in 1972. I had one of my buddies take my picture. I had rode the wreck train up to that scene. I happened to be up early to go to school that day, and I heard the train blowing in Dryden, the next town down. And I thought it was dark out. It was 6 o'clock in the morning. I thought, why? I looked out my windows and I see these passenger cars all lit up. It's coming into town, and I said, "What the hell's going on?" And then all of a sudden, I see what it was about. They were bringing the hook up to clean up that wreck. But I told my mother, I said, "I'm not going to school today. So I'm going up with this wreck train. I'm going to go up there." So there I was, and I had one of the guys take my picture. This is Ray Bennett. He was the foreman of the story I told you about the broken rail. The next picture shows them installing the broken rail at the scene. Yep, so that way it wouldn't be the railroad's fault, but because of their bad track, it was a broken rail that caused that wreck. So I went up with him and I had to take that picture. This was the aftermath, or the aftermath of the wreck. Shows the cars leading down the embankment. What you don't see behind that last boxcar is the caboose, and you'll see why in a second. Because there it laid. And those two guys got a heck of a ride that day. Go ahead, another photo of it. And it wasn't quite on its top, but it was way over on its side for sure. So here they are picking it up, getting ready to put it back on the set of trucks so they can get it out of there. The big hook is up there working. Watching that big hook in that operation was just amazing to me. That 250-ton crane picking up the stuff like this with not even a groan, hardly even an RPM change. And but things sometimes went awry. Go ahead. This was one of the trucks that had been way up in the air on the hook. And as he was swinging it around, the chain broke and that thing crashed down and luckily missed everybody because guys were walking back and forth all through this deal. And luckily it didn't hit anybody. This was the day they came into town. My friend Nick came to the house and said, "Hey, we got this Jordan spreader." He says, "We're cleaning out the right of way, pushing the trees and all the brush back." He says, "You got to take the ride." He said, "You can't imagine what we're pushing over with this thing." I said, "Okay." So I got up there and I'm riding the Jordan spreader. It looks like it's going fast, but it's not. It's just creeping along. They had They had two RS-11s. They were ex-Penske engines, 7600 series for power. So that was 4,000 horsepower. We were pushing with this. And they would push over masses of trees like this in just one swipe. And it was pretty amazing to watch. And here it is going up the line. It was going slow enough that I could get off and take a picture and get back on. And I took this picture. That's my friend Bart Fisk, just to show in size of the wing. It was on one side of that Jordan spreader. It was amazing. And of course, being that the roadbed was in such fine condition, this is where we put it on the ground now because it didn't spread the rails. So that was the end of that trip for that day. This was engine 403 and RS-11 low nose. Where it had gotten involved with a wreck, you can see the back end of it over on the right where it's all caved in, smashed in. And I got down the stair shops there one day and I took this picture. And one of the shop guys came out and got talking to me. And he said, "Well, what the railroad's going to do," he says, "we're going to cut off about a third of that frame." He says, "and we're going to weld a new piece of frame onto that." And he said, "and then we're going to put this thing back together." And it had never been done in U.S. railroading before. That they actually cut the frame off, had a new piece of frame and welded it back on there and put the engine back in service. So anyway, it just showed you the talent that was involved with the shop guys. Fair yards, of course, the locomotive shops in the back, massive. It took up 15 acres. The only thing that exists in this picture today is that red building because the UTLX, the tank car people, they now use some of this area yard for refurbishing, rebuilding tank cars. But this was one of the GP38 ACs sitting in the engine tracks. Some of what we called the yellow jackets, they were done, and these engines would come up the branch occasionally. They would use them. They didn't weigh much more than the RS3s and RS2s that they usually had. So I got to ride a lot of those too. And of course, the famous cigar band 301 with the paint job, Tuscan brown with the yellow stripe. that many of the engineers called a circus wagon, because they thought that was just a terrible paint job. One of the famous snowbirds or white elephants, depending on how you felt about them. I rode one to Binghamton on the Binghamton job one day, and I understood why they had armrests on the seats, because they rode so rough that if you didn't hang on, it'd throw you out of the seat. And but power, they had tremendous power when they were running good. Another one of the RS-11 low noses. This is into the engine service facility, the sand tower, where they would refuel, get the engines ready to go out on their next run. These are the 3 locomotives, the GP38-2s that I got to run around the yards with. They were hooked up and moldable, and like I said, me and the hostlers, we had the free reign to go around, so we went out, went up around behind the shops, came out around back into the engine service. More of the service tracks. And that was the famous Sayre footbridge. It was made for pedestrians, but it went right over the engine facility. So, you know, rail fans or whatever with cameras, they loved it. This is out on the main line. I believe that's coming towards Lodi, New York. And that was when those GP38 ACs were brand new. And the other interesting thing is if you look at the signal mast here, you'll see the cutout of the letter G. Well, on the Lehigh, because this was all upgrade from Geneva going towards Sayre, with these long freight trains, that they would have a problem getting restarted if they came to a complete stop. That G signal allowed them to pass a red signal at a very restricted speed and to keep moving. And hopefully by the time they got to the next signal, maybe that would be green. But they had to be prepared to stop. But that was a G signal on the railroad. Coxton, Pennsylvania, 3 of the Yellow Jackets. Many of those got repainted into Cornell red, as they call the paint job. But some of the best engines on the railroad. Back to Sayre again, and of course this shows you 3 different builders. There's locomotives here from EMD, Baldwin, and Alco. And at times, especially weekends, that was a busy place. There was always a lot of locomotives laying around. This was a meet when the railroad took the main line and made it single track. They created long passing sidings. This is at Gilbert, New York, and this is 2 of the freights meeting and one waiting for the other one to get out of the way. And again, the new GP38 ACs, as they're going along, they were new at that time. You can tell because the white is clean. There's, you know, there's no dirt kicked up on the snowplow. This is an old photograph of the first engine in the Sayre shops being hoisted by the new crane inside there. And this was outside of the powerhouse. Powerhouse with the 2 big stacks. They provided all the power, electrical, and air that serviced the shops and the yard. Back in the steam days, the Sayre roundhouse was standing still at that time, 48 stall roundhouse. And this engine in the forefront has what the boys called a hot water bottle. And the water bottle was to carry extra water, so we didn't have to stop it often. And that's attached to one of those 5000 series locomotives. This is the dead track kind of outside the shops. Usually a locomotive was placed there, either awaiting heavy repairs or scrap or sale. So that was the end of the line usually when a locomotive made it over there. One of the dual bugs, which the Lehigh had used many of those, especially on the branch lines. They tried to cut costs and throttle back from using traditional passenger trains, and they were having, you know, lower passenger revenue anyway. So they switched and did a lot. They had a lot of these. These were gas electrics, and the Lehigh used them all over. This was the road switcher of that era, of the steam era. This was a 10-wheeler. They were built in the Sayre shops by the Sayre shop forces. They were used because of all the branch lines with the light rails that they had to negotiate. They were wonderful little engines. They used them for both passenger and for freight. Unfortunately, I never got to see any of them. Two of them on a freight coming out of Cortland, heading towards Canastota, New York. Obviously a heavy train because they're using two of them. This is the Ithaca station, still stands. It's now a bank. For many years it was a restaurant. But I like this photo because it shows you how manicured the lawns and stuff were. The railroad took really good care and wanted a good site for the public to look at. This is the Black Diamond. This was coming into Ithaca. The guy in the foreground has just opened up the hatch to pull out the coupler, because on the other outside of the picture is a helper engine that's gonna hook onto the front of this and help the train out of town. Ithaca laid in a real steep bowl, so either way out of town they had to have helpers. So this train is facing eastbound, so it's getting ready to go towards Spencer, New York, towards Sayre. There's the actual usage of them. Helpers on the front end, and they're blasting up through to go to Spencer, New York, where the helper will cut off, and then the train will continue on to Sayre with a single unit. Diesel time. This is the Black Diamond again in the diesel era. This would have been mid to late 50s, maybe even early 60s, and this was in Ithaca, where they come into town. Now, there was a story, and some people have tried to say that it was just a wives' tale, and it was not true. There was a young lady who was the daughter, and I don't know of which railroad. I think it might have been Western Pacific, but her father was like the first vice president of this large Western railroad. Could have been Union Pacific, I don't remember which railroad. But she was going to school at Wells College up in Aurora, New York. Well, Aurora was on a branch line that went up along Cayuga Lake between Ithaca and Auburn. Well, the way she'd come to school would be by a leased Pullman car. And this is a Lackawanna car being taken out of the consist of a Lehigh Valley passenger train. And they're gonna take that out of there because the branch line leaves Ithaca and goes on a different route. And for those who doubted it, here's a picture of the yard engine taking that car to Aurora, New York, so that girl can go to school. Another picture in Cortland, New York. It was a blurry picture that, anyway, you can't read the banners, but some kind of a special event was happening. And again, they had two engines ready to pull a train going towards Canastota. This was in Dryden, New York, during the steam days. Later, that bridge was replaced with a low, I call them girder bridge. And my friend Jimmy Wyant came up through one day. Now you have to understand that that's the creek that the train is going over. And right where the photographer is standing was Mill Street in Dryden, New York. So that was a street and he's coming through. Well, Jimmy was coming the other way one day, and up ahead was this station wagon with a woman driving it, and he could see her coming. And then all of a sudden he realized she wasn't going to stop. So he dumped the air, and of course he's blowing the whistle, trying to get her to stop, and he hits her. And he rolled that car up along between the side of the engine and that girder bridge and rolled it right into a ball. And as he got stopped on the other side, he said that I knew I'd killed her. He said, I looked right at her. He says, I knew she was dead. And he said she couldn't survive. After he got the train stopped, he looked back, and here comes this woman up out of the creek soaking wet. When he hit her car, it knocked her out of the car, and she ended up in the drink. And he said, I was never so happy to see a human being alive in all my life. He said, I knew I'd killed her. Just a picture of a mainline Lehigh freight, probably coming this way. In the steam era. Number 798, My friend Nick Fisk was never one to want anything about the railroad. He didn't want to have anything. He didn't want to remember much. He just, you know, to him, it was just a job. But one day I was at a train meet with him and he saw a picture of that engine and he says, oh, he says, I got to have a picture of that because the guy was selling 8x10s. I said, well, what's so special about that? He said, well, we come out of Horseheads one night heading back to Sayre. Of course, we had a conductor and he said, how many cars do you want to take? We'll take them all. So we had 145 loads. And he said, and I was the lone fireman on it. And he says, I shoveled 22 ton of coal by myself between Elmira, New York and Sayre, Pennsylvania. He says, I nearly died from it. And, but he says, he said, I'll never forget that engine. That's yours truly sitting in actually in a U.S. Army locomotive up at the Seneca Army Depot. I've been invited up there to take pictures and what have you of that operation. And it was all done with an undercurrent because I told them how I was this, freelance writer and I was going to want to do a story about the depot and everything. Of course, the depot was running big time then. The Army was there and there was storage for munitions and missiles and everything. So I had to go through all, public information officer. And well, finally I got invited. Yeah, come on over. You can bring your camera because they didn't allow cameras in on the site for any reason. But with him along, I was okay. And I got to ride out with the old Fairbanks Morris engines and we picked up the new replacement EMD engines that were coming in. And but the article never got written. Oh, well, but I got my pictures. Okay. And me holding the Freeville sign before I donated it. And that's my front yard. And of course you can see I have a switch stand and a whistle sign. But that's the sign that I donated to the village for posterity. So, and that concludes my program. I appreciate your attention and it's been a blast actually. Thank you, Pete, for helping me out, but it's been a blast for Pete and I to come down here. And we made a day of it. And, Pete got some photographs of New Jersey Transit, and like I said, it's been a blast.
You get a lot of accolades from the film there.
Oh, really?
On the bottom.
Okay.
So you never really worked for the railroad?
Not officially.
You
Unofficially, I
got
did a lot of work.
You got that close?
Yeah, I was close. I mean, when I was in the 10th grade, they came in and they would come to my house at all hours of the day and night.
Good.
And 10 o'clock one night on a school night, and I'm in the 10th grade, and the engineer comes to the house. There was that Davy Whipple I told you about. He says, he looked at my parents. He's like, I have him for a while. Yeah, okay. I said, what's up? Well, the fireman had called in sick at the last minute, and they put a clerk on board to cover the fireman's spot because at that time they still had to have a fireman. And he didn't know any of the signals. And the engine was facing the wrong way down on the curved yard in East Ithaca. So, the engineer needed somebody that could pass the signals to him.
Railroad still goes through Freeville?
Not at all. It's all gone. All gone. Yep. Both lines were torn up. Both east, west, north, and south. About 10 miles south of Freeville, the line ends, and it services a propane storage facility. Hasn't had a train on it all year. So I question how long the rest of that's gonna last. So,
You mentioned Dryden a lot.
yes.
That's where John D. Rockefeller grew up. Is that true?
No, John D. Rockefeller was actually born in Richford, New York,
Okay.
which was
Right
the
there.
next town south.
Okay.
But his parents left the area at a very early age,
Right.
and they moved to Michigan. But that's why we have a road name called Michigan Hill, and it's because of them. There is a site up there where his log cabin had stood at one time, but he was from the area.
A short ways up from here. I used to be up in Ithaca a lot. My daughter went to school there. I just driving aimlessly, I came upon a house with a caboose back in the front yard, in the side.
Slide yard. That was probably in Hartford.
Okay,
And
not far.
No, Hartford, actually, I live in the town of Hartford now.
Okay,
And, but the fella has quite a collection of railroad lanterns and whatever. He's got a Lehigh Valley speeder out front.
right,
And he's got it's a former Delaware and Hudson caboose.
Yeah.
And he unfortunately doesn't do anything with any of it. So a lot of it's been out in the weather now for a long time.
yeah, I went in there.
Kind of sad.
The only other thing I remember from that area is I used to stay in the Lackawanna station. When I would go up to see my daughter, the Lackawanna station, I believe, had accommodations built into, I guess, passenger cars, and they had like a motel using the rail cars.
Okay, I think you're thinking of the Ithaca Lehigh station, and they
Yeah.
had some rail cars alongside, and it was all part of that restaurant that used to be
Yes,
there.
right.
And then later that got sold, and the bank came in and bought it, and now it's the Shimon Canal Company Bank.
Did any of the employees live in Freeville?
Excuse me?
Did any of the employees, Lehigh Valley employees live in Freeville?
No, other than Ken Rice, the agent, he lived in Freeville. The rest of these guys most of them lived in Cortland or Auburn, New York. And Cortland was like 8 miles away, so it was kind of close. But, and then of course, many of the crews came out of Sayre, that's how I got to meet so many of them, because, today I'd take a ride and it'd be the normal crew. Tomorrow I'd take the ride and be some new guy that I hadn't seen before, but he was just a Sayre man. So. Yeah. If no other questions, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Like I said, I forgot to do it tonight, but I usually start off my program by saying, this is not gonna be the normal, here's an engine, let's talk about it. Okay? My program is a little different from my perspective. So, but I appreciate your time and, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. The next meeting will be on November 9th, the second Thursday for the LNHR show. We hope to see you there. Good night.
That was good. I went to Cornell, so I'm familiar with it.